I'm going to try to very politely put my finger in your chest tonight, because what I think I'm going to lay out is the argument for why this is a very different conversation about who we are as communities, and what does this mean about us as residents and communities, about what we do. So I'm going to start with a story. So almost exactly 3 years ago, the school leadership and community leadership in the small town of Darrington, Washington, approached us around work that we've been doing for the last 12 years about trauma-informed practice in schools. So that's been a predominant part of the work that we've been doing as a research and development unit here at WSU Spokane. Here's why they approached us if the name doesn't mean anything to you. Darrington is the community where the Oso landslide occurred 3 years ago. And 43 people died as the side of that mountain let go. Actually, colleagues of ours are there today because it is 3-year anniversary and another side of the mountain is letting go right now. So the issue of the freshness of that as a natural disaster is very much in our minds for that family, the families there in the community. Here's how they approached us, and that's why I wanted to open this. What they ended up saying is, we know that we're going to recover from this tragedy. It may take us time, it may be a difficult issue for us to deal with, but we're going to recover. But what they said was that as a community, here's what the gift of the landslide is. We're not okay as a community. And this has kind of stripped away the premise that we are okay. And we're not okay because of generational substance abuse. We're not okay because of generational domestic violence, isolation, and disconnection from people that are living in the area. And they said, the legacy that we want from the landslide is that we become okay as a community. I think for Darrington, as a small community, that's the big conversation for us as a country in the face of this discussion. So the argument I'm going to put forward to you is this whole issue of adverse childhood experiences and developmentally the trauma that follows for many people who are exposed to multiple difficult things early in life is a different conversation. This is not talking about suicide. This is not talking about depression. It's talking about a public health crisis that we're only just starting to get our arms around in terms of understanding the implications. So I'm going to start really quickly by reviewing this issue of adverse childhood experiences. And if I wanted to make sure if this is not a terribly familiar conversation that we started there. So I'm going to walk these things through. I'm going to hit 10 topical items. And here's how you interact with ACEs if you have not done this. So adverse childhood experiences, I'll start using the acronym ACEs. For each of these that I put up, the question that you have to ask yourself, and keep this private, this is a personal issue, is did this occur in your family when you were growing up before you reached the age of 18? So that's the frame as we start to look at these issues. So here are the first 4. It's emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect, and that's under the big umbrella of child maltreatment. But we think of these as 4 distinct kinds of dimensions as we start dealing with this, and since the late 1970s, we've been building a system of response in child protective services. But the thing to really recall is that we didn't actually start that as a national conversation until the middle 1960s. We didn't finish building out a national system of child protective services until about 1980. As a culture, this is still a new conversation, this idea about publicness, openness, about what happens behind closed doors in families is a different conversation for us. But these are the 4 that we've most significantly organized ourselves around. What we know about ACEs is we've got to expand the conversation. So the next one is separation or divorce in a family. And I want to always stress, this is not an issue of saying that automatically a single parent is going to end up creating tremendous stress for the children growing up in that family, but no one would argue that being a single parent is an easy piece of work to do. So where many people prosper, the issue of having one parent, we know, is actually a quite significant developmental stressor on children. It's also domestic violence. So the single most common call any law enforcement agency in the United States will make is going to be a domestic violence call. It's also amongst the most dangerous calls that any police officer is going to end up making. It's caregiver mental health and caregiver substance abuse problems. It's incarceration of a family member, again before you turned 18, and it's death of a parent. So when we talk about ACEs, these are the 10 things that we're talking about. The power inside ACEs is to change the conversation from saying it's this single-dimensional issue, including things like sexual abuse and domestic violence, and to say it's that as important as those things are as individual events and processes in people's lives, it's the fact that if one of these things happens to you, you have an 80% chance that more than one of these things is going to happen to you. So it piles on in life. That's one of the characteristics of ACEs. So I wanted to give you the first 10 and then suggest we still have to open this conversation a little broader. So it's issues community violence, homelessness, racism, and historical trauma. All fit broadly in terms of this kind of issue of chronic stress that begins to operate critically in the lives of people. So in this slide, over on the left, is kind of the classical way that they talk about ACEs. So that as ACEs develop, there are struggles in terms of what stress does to the developing brain that leads to a higher probability you're going to engage in high-risk behaviors, which increases the chance that you're going to develop disease, which increases the chance that disability and early death is going to follow. Over on the right, this is work of a group that we have had the privilege of working with in California out of a community called Richmond, and the name of the organization is RISE. And what they've done that we think is really helpful is they've ended up saying, it's not just this as a personal event, it's the fact that we all live in communities. We all live inside this bigger set of relationships, and the context that that these kinds of struggles occur in becomes really important. So this issue of generational embodiment of historical trauma, it's the issue of the kinds of circumstances that happen within communities. So in research that we've done as a group here at WSU, one report released at the request of the Washington legislature, another report that we're releasing this spring. We've looked at academic outcomes and characteristics of communities from K through 12th grade and for school readiness, kindergarten assessments over the last 4 years here in Washington. And here's a conclusion that we've reached, is that there are two drivers about communities that dictate academic success in communities more compellingly than anything else that we know. The first one is the issue of poverty in the community. So we've known for a very long time that poverty is this huge demand. But poverty does not cause ACEs. Poverty can accelerate ACEs. It can end up making the options you have about how you can escape from these situations much more complex, but it doesn't drive the development of adversity. What we found is after accounting for poverty is as the percent of the adults in Washington state communities, including here in Spokane, as the percent of adults who say, when I was growing up, I had 3 or more ACEs. As that percentage increases, academic success in that community goes down. And that's after accounting for poverty. So when we talk about the context, the community context about this, we absolutely have to focus on the individual, but we've got to recognize we're all part of community, and that the community of our family, of our neighborhood, of the city that we live in also ends up having an effect on the environment that we're operating in. Here's the major summary for the ACEs study. This is now over 600 peer-reviewed journal articles, so this is not an interesting finding. This is mainstream science when we start to talk about these issues. But from the original study, what they did is they recruited 17,000 people who were in the Kaiser Permanente HMO system in San Diego. These were healthy adults coming in for healthy adult medical visits. And they were asked, would you be willing to participate in the study? We'd like to ask you those 10 questions about what it was like when you were growing up. And then we'd like you to give us permission to have access to your medical records, and we'd like to have you permit us to stay in touch with you. So this is still, more than 25 years later, an active study. They're still tracking these individuals. The two things I would really highlight here is over on the right where it says ACEs study. The thing to take away first is that it's less than 40%. Only about a third of people said, you know what, when I was growing up, none of those things happened to me. Over 60% of us in the United States will tell you that at least one of those things happened to us. And about 1 in 4 of us will end up saying it was 3 or more of these things that happened when we were growing up. So the first thing to take away about ACEs is that this is not automatically a story of extraordinary loss. What it is a common experience. It's the unique thing that we get to share with each other, is how common adversity in the lives of families in the United States and across the world is. So we've been able to validate ACEs on every continent in the world. So this is now, again, it's a universal description of human experience. But here are some of the things that we know. The ACE dose effect is as your ACEs increase, you are in a group where your risk for multiple things also increases, and it does it in a pretty stepwise approach. The second thing to take away are the implications of the finding, because what the research now, again, supported by multiple research teams that have done this, tells us is that you're between 4 and 12 times more likely to have a major mental health struggle at some point in your adult life. So it goes from 4 times increased risk for depression to 12 times increased risk for suicide. That you're much more likely to report chronically just poor health, just feeling bad. And you're much more likely to develop diabetes and heart disease and liver disease as a consequence with this. I've spent most of my career working around high-risk families and high-risk communities. Up until the ACEs study, I couldn't get people who didn't share that experience of violence in their lives to pay attention to violence. We swim in violence as a culture. More than 38,000 people will die of gun violence this year in the United States. So we swim in violence. It's part of the environment that we operate within. We're a little desensitized as a consequence because of this. So here was the significance for me as somebody who has been committed into doing this work. When we're saying that you have 3 times increased risk of developing heart disease as the #1 killer of adults in the United States, this is now an us conversation. This is not a them conversation any longer. And that's the great significance inside the ACEs research. Over on the right, just before I move off this slide, the percentages there where it says Burfus, Washington State, that's the CDC household annual survey that's done with about 30,000 people in Washington every year. And for 3 years running, from 2009 through 2011, they asked these questions about the ACEs as part of the CDC survey. So those numbers are based on about 40,000 Washington neighbors. And you'll see that the percentages reflect the original study to a very large degree. So what I want to do is, now that I've kind of reframed this back to ACEs, and again, I want to come back to where Caitlin opened. So this idea, this is an issue about who we are as individuals, but what does this mean for our community? How do we end up dealing with this? So where I want to move is I want to start to talk to you about what is the cost to us as communities in terms of what we're dealing with. We're going to start with mental health services. Full disclosure, I'm a shrink, so I've got a perspective associated with this stuff. But I will tell you, as somebody who does therapy, that I think I am only a small slice of the solution on ACEs and trauma. I think that this is an us conversation as we deal with these issues. That we don't get to be on the sidelines except by choice. You can't unring this bell once this information is in your hands. This is trends from 2004 through 2013 about the individual cost for each of us in the United States for mental health services. So you see it's running from about $93 per person up around $119 or so as we go across these years. One thing to point out is what happened in 2008, and that's the Great Recession. And what happened is we flattened out in terms of public investment, and we've not recovered. That we've been flat with this. But this gives you a sense of what this means in a very personal sense about how much money out of your taxes go into supporting this one sector of response. When we think about this in terms of the impact, it's 13% of all children in the United States each year would have a diagnosable mental health condition. Mostly we don't see it because we can't get kids into assessment and care. For adults, it's about 17% of adults will have a diagnosable condition at some point during a given year. And again, it's an access to care issue that becomes a major problem. So a large portion of this goes untreated as we look at these issues. But here's the point that I wanted to make first, is that cumulatively, the expense here overall for mental health services annually is about $56 billion in the United States. And about $9 billion of that goes directly to children in terms of mental health services. But what we also know, with research that's been done fairly recently, is that when we start to look at what are the causes of mental health, in terms of this as a disability, the kind of burden and pain, about 40% of the explanatory power of understanding all the mental health conditions that we see in children are explained by understanding the adversity history that they've got, the trauma history that they've got. And it's about 1 in 3 when we start looking at this in terms of adult onset. So this is not a disconnected conversation, it's the same conversation. ACEs and resulting trauma don't explain everything, but they explain a great deal. In terms of looking at this through child maltreatment and domestic violence, 2 other places where these are direct contributions into ACEs, and they end up being places where we've been at this work long enough that we are able to start looking at some of the costs to us as communities. So for child maltreatment, the estimated lifetime cost for 1 year of accepted referrals into child protective services, 1 year, is $124 billion over the lifespan of those individual children. What we're looking at is about 686,000 kids a year entering into the child protective service system. For domestic violence, the estimated annual cost is about $8.3 billion again. Point that I want to make before I move on, and I've got a couple of other impact issues that are a little closer to home here in Spokane, is at this point, this is money that's not going to repair roads. It's not building new schools. It's not building bridges. It's not supporting early child care programs as we're dealing with it. It is money that is going to the end of the process to try to get to whatever repair we can get to. Most people would argue this is not a wise investment strategy. So this is part of the conversation, is what do we ask our representatives to do about prioritization of the kinds of services that we need to deal with. I'm going to quickly walk you through 2 studies that we've done here in Spokane. We've had the privilege of being able to work with Spokane institutions for the last 20 years in doing this work. One of our very close partners has been Head Start here in Spokane. Head Start is a big urban program, serves nearly 1,000 kids a year. In terms of the service, Head Start is the premier early learning program in the United States. So in working with Head Start here to become a trauma-informed organization over a 6-year period, one of the steps that we took is we introduced a conversation with parents about their ACEs history and the ACEs history of the children that were enrolled in Head Start. And we have done this now. The data is based on about 1,200 families. We've actually got about 1,600 completed screens. And so what we did is we took the original ACEs questions and we modified it only this way. The 4 questions about child abuse and neglect, we just changed into 1 question, which is, since your child was born or when you were growing up, if we were talking to the parent, did your family have any contact with Child Protective Services? And the reason why we changed the questions is, as many of you are in the room, we're what are called mandated reporters. So if we have a suspicion of child maltreatment, we have to call. It is not a discretionary decision. We're required by law in order to do that. So we did not want to open a conversation about adversity and need with a family and then have the off-ramp be instantly that we were picking up the phone to call Child Protective Services. So we wanted to be smart about not increasing risk for the people that we dealt with. But what we found is the 1 question still got us that sensitivity in terms of exposure. So here's what we learned in our town. In a program, the only qualification to get into Head Start is that you meet income eligibility. So you have to be low income. That's it. 1 out of every 2 of the parents that we talked to, that the staff at Head Start who were trained to do these interviews talked to, 1 out of every 2 of the parents said, when I was growing up, I experienced 4 or more ACEs. Just pause and hold on to that one for a second. But then talking about their 3- and 4-year-olds, the parents ended up saying that my 3- or 4-year-old, 1 out of 4 of the enrolled Head Start children had already, by the age of 4, experienced 4 or more ACEs, based on their parents' report. This is not an unusual experience. The privilege we've had is we were one of the first communities and first partnerships that actually allowed us to start to collect some of this information. Over on the right of this slide is we then took the report of the parents about their children's ACEs and we crosswalked it onto the independent and blind assessments of teachers of the developmental progress of kids. So let me explain why all the lines are pointing up. It's because even when we screw up as adults in the lives of children, children continue to grow despite us. So anytime we start measuring developmental trajectories, all lines will always point up. The green line on that slide are the kids with 4 or more ACEs, the 1 and 4. And what this is demonstrating, and what's charted here is the issue of pre-literacy. Can you recognize letters? Can you identify words on a page even if you can't read? Those would be examples of pre-literacy skills. Is that this is tracking a year in Head Start from enrollment to a year later. And what this is showing is based on teachers' independent ratings, not knowing the ACE history of the children, that the children with 4 or more ACEs, that 1 in 4 children, were being rated by the teachers as being developmentally lagging as they came into Head Start, and a year later, Head Start had not bent the curve. That separation was still there. Is that tracking for everybody the way that I explained that? This is a terribly concerning finding for a great program, because what it says is that a significant number of the needs of kids are not being addressed by current practice, that there is a gap that we have to start to address. So this is Head Start in our community. I've got to unpack this one a little bit for you, but briefly, the study that we did with 10 elementary schools here in Spokane in 2010, so this is now about 6 years ago that we did this study. We went, because we had a relationship with these 10 elementary schools, and they were in Spokane Public Schools as well as the Valley and Meade were the places where we were looking. What we ended up doing was we got class rosters that had been all names stripped out and just numbers put in, and we randomly selected half the kids. So we ended up having a conversation about 2,100 randomly selected kids from 10 elementary schools in Spokane. We went to the educators and we said, we think that you get to hold a great deal of information about the children in your care, and we would like to ask you the ACEs questions about what you know. And we did it because it's a safe way to open a conversation without the intrusion into the family and a variety of other kinds of concerns. So what they told us, we trained them, don't speculate, don't guess, report what you factually know. The one variation on that is that our experience is if a kid comes in, and I'm quoting a child here in Spokane, and says, last night I watched daddy hold a knife to mommy's throat, you accept that as a factual statement, because there is no evidence to say that children or adults will lie unless they are motivated to lie, unless there is some sort of a cause behind it. So what we know, based on what the educators knew, is that they didn't know about the ACE history of about half the kids. So this is a conservative approach as we start to look at these issues. But for the other half of the kids, they knew of at least 1 ACE. For 1 out of 5 of the children, they knew of at least 2. And for 1 out of 10 of the children, they knew of 3 or more ACEs that had already occurred by the time children were in elementary schools. We had high poverty and low poverty schools included in this. What we ended up seeing, not surprisingly, is that as poverty gets concentrated, these kinds of problems also concentrate up. So in some of the schools, the 3 or more ACEs was 40% of the kids in school. We work in schools where it is 70 and 80% of the children are coming in with 3 or more ACEs as they're working into their educational process. This is what's called an odds table, and the way you read it is you go to the bottom line with no known ACEs and you set their academic experience with a value equal to 1. And what you're looking for is how many more times likely are children in the other groups to have academic problems. So it's 1.5 times with 1 ACE, 2.5 times with 2 ACEs, 3 times more likely after we accounted for everything else that we could control for. ACEs became the single most important thing to know about the history of the child. 3 times greater risk of academic failure with 3 or more ACEs. So if you read across the top, 5 times increased risk that this is a child that's in a group with chronic attendance problems. If you don't have seat time in school, you can't learn. 6 times more likely that these kids are going to be identified as a behavior problem, a chronic behavior problem in schools. Why should you care about that as taxpayers? First, what makes us distinct as a democracy is the fact that we commit to universal education through the end of high school. And now increasingly the conversation is through the end of college. We've invested as a democracy in education. This pulls down the success of our education systems. The second issue is I'm going to focus in on the issue of the behavioral problems. What we know is that as new teachers graduate and enter the profession, if you track them 5 years later, between 25 and 40% of those new teachers will be out of the profession 5 years after entering. And the reason I'm giving you a range is that there have been a couple of studies that have been done that point at this. So conservatively, 1 out of 4, maybe as high as 4 out of 10. When you ask people who have left the profession why they left for a variety of reasons. The level of money that they were making, they had children, they wanted a different kind of job. But one of the things that they'll identify is I was not prepared for the kinds of behaviors that were going to occur in my class. I was not trained for it. I had no skill set in order to deal with this. So the work we do in schools is come in behind to try to see if we can help with the on-the-job training that's necessary in order to be able to actually have the skills to respond to this. Every time that you've got to launch a search for a new teacher in your neighborhood school, this is money out of the pocket of that school, from curriculum, from increasing salaries to retain teachers. It is money that's going to some other part of this as a process. ACEs and the resulting trauma steal the wealth of our communities. That's the thing that I came here to share with you. So this is the part of my presentation where I've just depressed the bejesus out of you in this conversation. Because now I want to shift to what I fundamentally think is a very hopeful conversation. So ACEs tells us what the problem is. It doesn't tell us what we should do. Where we have the opportunity to linkage here is we can start to draw from almost 30 years of mental health treatment about how do we actually treat and help people recover from this kind of trauma. So you've got a sense of the scope and the cost. We actually have methodology that is developed over 30 years about how to deal with these issues. And from that 30 years of work have come a series of consensus proposals about how you help people recover. So this is coming from a mental health perspective. The term that they talk about when they talk about the kind of developmental consequences that follow from being exposed to adversity early in life is they refer to it as complex trauma, to separate it from car accidents and other kinds of things that happen to people. So complex trauma is in part ACEs. So the definition is multiple risks. That's ACEs. The second part of key issues to deal with is that complex trauma is describing a biological process. And I want to go take you back to the Head Start kids, those 1 in 4 kids with 3 or more ACEs. Here's what we know. At 3 and 4 years old, if you are living in that kind of chaos, there are 2 critical things to understand. The first one is you have no control. You can't leave, you can't escape, you can survive. That's the job. The second is that at 3 and 4, no matter how bright that 3 or 4-year-old is, you don't have language to make sense out of what's happening to you. So I can tell you as a trauma specialist what I know about just looking in the audience. With maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, everybody sitting in this room as an adult is a trauma survivor. Everybody in this room has lost someone they love, has been a victim of crime, has had a major life-threatening illness. This is our common heritage. Trauma and stress is not the problem. It is the early critical exposure to stress at early developmental levels that is. Because what happens, what we know biologically, is that with high levels of experienced stress, the biological response is an emergency response. It is managed by a whole family of what are referred to as stress hormones. And stress hormones actually operate as neurotoxins. They can kill and stunt neurodevelopment. So what we can demonstrate through the biological science is that as a group, as ACEs increase, You have an adjustment process that is basically your body and your developing system trying to come to grips with this as an issue to cope. So at that point, what we know and we can demonstrate is that with high levels of trauma, we actually see shifts in brain function and shifts in brain structure. We can do it on things like the amygdala having lower volume in the brain of children who have grown up with significant stress. Why is the amygdala particularly important? It is our safety regulator in our brain. It is constantly monitoring for this issue of safety. The characteristic of complex trauma is that it's persistent, but it's unpredictable. So one of the consequences of persistent stress that is unpredictable is you never know when you can let down. You have to be on alert all the time, both mentally and physically, in terms of how you're responding to this. So the main thing to take away from understanding one of the most profound implications of ACEs is ACEs steals safety. And there are a lot of parents in the room right now, and I'm a parent as well, and I would tell you that I think one of the things we share is we saw our job was to create a condition for our children where they believed that basically the world was a reasonably safe place. Trauma from ACEs steals safety, and it makes safety become one of the most significant drivers for why people behave the way they do as they try to cope with trauma. That is a practical tool because we can do things to try to increase safety, to help people break out of this kind of cycle through our actions, for how we take it. The last point is, who you love may not be the person that you can count on. The reason why I always want to, on this slide, end with that point is that when we see children in pain, the natural reaction is to blame whoever the caregiver is. And respectively, I want to tell you it's a dead end. It gives us no tools. It takes us no place in terms of how it is that we can respond more effectively. And what we know is that parents who raise children with multiple ACEs and resulting trauma risk were themselves children who grew up in exactly the same circumstances. What we have is a multi-generational set of problems. We have to be equally committed to the care and recovery of the adults in these exchanges as we are for the recovery and well-being of the children. And if we don't go in that direction, we have very little chance at being able to shift this as a community problem. Because this is a biological process, what we need to do is we need to come back, we need to talk about brain development. So this is from the work of a man named Bruce Perry, who's a very well-known person in trauma work. He actually has about 10 of these brain principles that are established in science. These are the 4 I think are most relevant. The first one is, the way we are organized genetically is to depend on other people to organize who we are. We are that interactive. The reason why we have a big portion of our brain at the back of our head committed to vision is that we are visual beings to connect with each other. So we organize how our brain is structured through our relationships with other people. And when those relationships start to get disrupted, it starts to have a cascading set of effects in terms of the ability to grow as strong and well as you can. So what this says is the first thing that we have to focus on if we're going to talk about trauma is our human connection. That the best established evidence-based practice, for those of you who are in the professions, with this is relationship. It's not specific technique. It is relationship. And I just summarized about 70 years worth of research for you in that statement. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to good technique and curriculum and all the other kinds of things that we worry about. But if you don't get the relationship right, the rest of it doesn't matter. And relationship by itself is therapeutic. And we are wired that way. Second principle is our brain is functions hierarchically. And this is a challenge for those of us who have been educated through around education or around social services and around health, because we've been trained that we are basically rational human beings. And what the evidence about how we're organized is, no, we're not. And all you have to do is kind of reflect on the last 24 hours of your life, and you're probably going to agree with me, that mostly, no, we are not rational beings. What happens is our first reaction is always reflexive, and it's based in survival. Our second reaction is principally emotional. So as we end up looking at these issues, the last thing that comes online is our ability to make moral choice, our ability to use memory, our ability to do planning and to be part of a solution. So under stress, what happens is we go to our more basic reactions. We are driven by emotion and we are driven by reflex. Let me tell you that in working in schools, and we've been doing, as I said, we've been doing this work for 12 years, our immediate and early win when we are in schools is we explain this, because you can't hold on to this information about stressed brains can't make rational choices, which is another way to say what I just said. You can't be a teacher and hold on to punitive disciplinary practices and have that fact, because it explodes this idea that kids overwhelmingly, when they act out, are doing it from willful disobedience. What they are is they're flailing, they are struggling, they are caught in the moment. And our duty is to help those kids be held accountable with compassion in terms of how we deal with this, because punishment teaches nothing. So there, I just summarized about 150 years worth of research for you. All punishment does is it suppresses behavior. If I am afraid of you, I will not do what is going to make you hurt me. But as soon as you're gone, I've learned nothing and I'll go back to the behavior that I had. So one of the very early wins we have in this conversation working inside schools is this shift to understand that accountability is important, consequences are important, but punishment doesn't work. We develop our brains by use. So if struggle for survival is the dominant thing that you're involved in, those parts of your brain get overdeveloped. But here's why this is fundamentally a hopeful conversation. Our brains continue to change through experience until the moment we die. So you do not have the same brains that you walked in with. The connections have been made differently now. So there is every reason to believe that we can end up actually being able to make an impact. It's easier early in life than it is later, but it is still hopeful even later that we can end up doing this. So although we're dealing with trauma as a biological process that we're trying to manage through our human connections, fundamentally, this is a hopeful conversation and the biology is on our side in this conversation. There are two big ways that you think about how trauma impacts people, and I've been talking about the first one. Triggers comes out of trauma, and it's around this issue of safety. So I'm not going to, you're all capable of reading, I'm not going to read the slide to you. I just want to highlight the issue of shame. It comes back to this punishment issue, that basically the concept around shame is that we are doubling down as a society on the belief that shame works, that somehow this is a motivator to action. What it does for people who come from trauma is trigger them. It puts them into fight, flight, freeze. It's the struggle around survival becomes the issue. One of the simplest things that we can do is to start to make choices on our end where we stop triggering people, to be intentional about how we try to organize our exchanges. So it's this concept of safety and how we manage safety becomes one of the very practical ways that we start to be able to shift the conversation. It's also about this critical issue, and it's in the first statement on this slide. If, as I'm growing up, I do not have a strong connection with a stable caregiver who teaches me how to get my needs met, I still have needs, and I will meet them as best I can. This is critical because, and I'm speaking to you as a psychologist who diagnoses and treats on this, the major power inside the trauma conversation is trauma is about coping. It's about adaptation. It can get to the point where your efforts at adapting are so disrupted that a mental health diagnosis is appropriate. But we should not pull that trigger too quickly. That we can start to look at often very unusual behavior through this lens of this is somebody doing the best they knew and doing something that worked for them at some other point, but it doesn't work now. That's a profoundly different conversation about how are we trying to help when that's the case. So I believe treatment for trauma is absolutely necessary, but only if we create relationships that we are each individually responsible for being more connected, for being more responsive, that every one of us carries that option to do this. Physical needs are unusual kinds of ways that people will act, but again, even in extreme instances, hoarding. I'm working in schools. I've had 3 kids this year who are stealing food from other kids' backpacks, and they're hiding the food. That's hoarding behavior. Hoarding behavior is an extreme and very disturbing behavior, but we don't necessarily need to move to diagnosis to understand it. We can view it through this trauma lens and end up saying this was an adaptive strategy that's now not connected. Why is that so important? It's because to give a label to somebody is an extraordinarily powerful thing to do. Diagnoses follow people, and we should only diagnose when we actually, from the diagnosis, offer hope, offer an opportunity to get to something better through treatment. Trauma opens this up as a different conversation. Mastery is the last one. It's inherent in us as human beings to try to feel good and in control of our environment. If you are hanging out with a 1-year-old who is learning to walk, you cannot stop them. The drive is from inside. And this happens around mastery in all sorts of ways. So a distorted kind of mastery can be bullying. So bullying, and it's not to excuse the behavior, it's to try to understand what are the alternatives other than punishment and isolation when you see somebody as a bully. Often kids who bully on themselves come from significant trauma histories. What they're struggling for is control, mastery. And understanding that gives you a different range of options in terms of how you think about what you can do to break that cycle of destructive behavior. But finally, this is not about just getting to the issue of release of pain. It's about, fundamentally, as human beings, we're about growth. And at that point, what we're talking about falls under the category of how do we build resilience. So the definition of resilient is that despite adversity, you continue to grow. So you can't be resilient unless you've experienced adversity. If you've ever played a sport, you understand that. You have to fail in order to ultimately succeed. That this is a human experience with this. My argument with you, just very, very briefly, is building resilience is really a practical set of targets. It's how do we build hope in people? It's how do we increase their sense that they have control and choice, that they can actually influence their environment, that's self-efficacy. It's reversing this idea about being so preoccupied about how we talk to each other to recognize that relationship to emotional regulation, to the skills to be able to connect effectively with another set of people are the things that we have to have before we ever get to good reasoning skills. That we've got to reverse the way that we think about these things. And finally, by what we do and how we respond with this, we can create the environment socially that ends up having very, very powerful impact. I'll give you a very simple example before I move off this point. Everybody's familiar with the phrase hangry? Okay. I was very conscious I'm talking at dinner time. One of our advices to teachers is keep granola bars in your desk, because a lot of behavior in little kids can be resolved by getting their blood sugar up. So it's practical. The trauma work is not about big transformational change. It's about small steps intentionally done and intentionally held. When you leave tonight, a very simple challenge is to be kinder than you think you need to be. To remember basic things about what have defined us as a culture. We've lost track in some really important ways. This is one of the places where we go with kids. When the kids have trouble, we go to diagnosis. It's our go-to solution. What I want to point out, of those 13% of kids who are eligible for a diagnosis, what drives the diagnosis? It's not anxiety and depression, it's attention deficit. As a psychologist, I diagnose and treat attention deficit disorder. I believe it's a legitimate brain condition. I also know that to an overwhelming degree, we mistake trauma coping strategies that show an impulsivity and attention and concentration problems, we relabel it as a medical condition and we medicate. So my advice to practicing people who do this work is be very slow to pull the trigger on ADHD and to ask the questions about trauma history, because what you may be dealing with is an understandable coping set of strategies and a skill deficit approach that allows you to have different ways to deal with this. Here are the three magic things about trauma-informed practice. It's relationship, it's regulation skills, and it's giving people an opportunity to feel competent. That these become the way we can organize moment to moment, various ways that we end up dealing with this. There's a way for us to open this conversation in a significant way about how we deal with this, and I'm just going to highlight some issues. We're focused in education. This is a big national conversation in education about the adoption of these practices. There's a lawsuit going on in federal court in Los Angeles right now against the Compton Unified School District, filed as a class action lawsuit that said that Compton's failure to identify and respond to the trauma history of children in their schools was a denial of basic educational rights. If this is resolved in favor of the plaintiffs, this is going to change educational policy in the United States. So this is how serious this conversation, this is not an interest, it's not 25 years ago, this is not an interesting scientific statement. This is the education, this is core policy conversations. It's important for you to understand that as engaged citizens about where this is going. But it's healthcare. There is an opportunity here to think about what happens from the moment you walk into a reception office, because a practitioner will tell you if it was a bad reaction in exchange with the receptionist, it cascades through everything else that ends up happening in that encounter. So we have to become trauma-informed systems. We have to have a collective responsibility for dealing with this. Workforce development. The folks that go into skills training programs are often kids and young adults that education in the conventional sense failed them. So they come with significant histories of adversity and trauma. And when you talk to employers in this community and across the country, what they will tell you is that it's not the hard skills that are our problem, it's the soft skills. It's not being able to take criticism. It's not being organized enough that you can show up on time. It's not being able to sequence yourself so that you're actually able to complete a complicated sequence set of jobs. We can introduce these issues into employment issues. Criminal justice, Spokane is doing this. We have drug courts. We have DV courts. We have mental health courts, which are all accountable structures that move you outside of the criminal justice system to understand that this is really a conversation about monitoring people with very great needs and getting services around them. So we're shifting the conversation. There is good work going on. Our responsibilities as residents of this community is to speak up. From whatever position we stand in, talk to your neighbors. Take this back into the workplace and open this conversation. And I'm going to give you an invitation. We live here in Spokane. We're on this campus. We're about 150 yards or so away. If you would like a continuing conversation with us, contact us. You have the information through this. I don't know where this is going to take us. I can tell you that we believe that if we don't ground into these community conversations, we can't get better. And that we owe it to ourselves and to our children that we do. Thanks very much.